Something about it.
Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Namahinui kia koutou. Kia ora. I rise to take a call on this bill. Mr Speaker, we're talking about something of great importance to New Zealanders, which is our oceans. Because in New Zealand, we love our oceans and we want to protect it. We're a coastal people. It's not just about how we get our income from our vibrant fishing and aquaculture industries. It's also where we play. It's where we recreate. This is we boat, we fish, we surf. And as we saw over the arena, which has been touched on numerous times in this debate, that sacred relationship we have with our moana, our water in New Zealand, was shook right to the core. Because oil on our beaches wasn't this academic thing you saw on TV and the papers. It was something New Zealanders could see, they could touch, they could smell. And it was something that they were deeply shocked with our government's response and the failure to act with the haste, the urgency, with the expertise and infrastructure needed to respond to what was our worst maritime disaster. We saw in Tauranga, Mr Speaker, I regularly went to Tauranga in the days and weeks following there. And what I saw there was almost like the relationship someone has when someone dies. In the first days we saw the shock. People couldn't believe what was happening on our waters. Then we saw the anger because there was no one on the beaches to clean up the stuff. There was no booms at some of the estuaries. Then we saw the sadness. The sadness is those dead birds and those dead animals washed up on the beaches. So it's good to be in this house, the House of Law in New Zealand, to be debating how we can improve our marine environmental and safety protection legislation. So, I mean, looking at the structure of the bill, it's an omnibus bill. I think it's got three main parts of importance. So it amends a couple of bills, the Maritime Transport Act, and the Exclusive Economic Zone Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Act. It does a couple of big changes. The first is to amend the Maritime Transport Act in terms of port and harbour safety, local regulation, navigation safety. In terms of the EEZ Bill Act, in terms of marine pollution regulation, it changes the way that rules and regulations are developed. And lastly, it allows New Zealand to accede to these three international maritime conventions, which we've talked about and I'll talk about at some length. So first up, we'd like to say the Green Party is welcoming the introduction of this bill. We will be supporting it. We urge the public to make a submission to the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee. We want to hear from experts because there's some good parts in this bill and there's a few questions we'd also like to raise. So in this contribution, Mr Speaker, I'd like to touch very briefly on some of the environmental and safety protection changes advocated in this piece of legislation, but then touch on the financial liability we saw with the RENA. So first up, the safety provisions in the legislation we think make a lot of sense. They look pretty common sense with a cursory reading, and that's why we welcome hearing from the harbour masters, hearing from the experts, and hope they make submissions to select committees. The bill gives effect to the amendments to the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, and this is something we've heard in this debate. It's curious that this government is quite happy to go against all the international evidence, all the call from New Zealanders, both experts and lay public, for lowering the blood alcohol level. But internationally, they're quite happy for seafarers and watchkeepers and people just doing environmental monitoring around ships to have a blood alcohol level of 0.5. But when it comes to people driving a ton of metal down the road at 100 kilometres per hour, they're quite happy to have legal intoxication. I think it's quite curious, and I think the mad contradiction of the government's policies has been quite graphically highlighted with this clause. We're seeing the 37 pages of amendments to the Exclusive Economic Zone Bill. 37 pages after a law we only passed a month ago. I think the government bench should be embarrassed. It's an absolute shambles, and you've got to ask, what's happening in their decision-making processes to have this happening? Are these different ministers not talking to each other? Because it's an embarrassing shambles, highlights the sloppy process that is mostly highlighted by the fact that we saw over the arena it was the taxpayer who's had to pick up the tab because of the government's laziness, because of the government's incompetence, but also because of the government's simple inability to read the briefings to the incoming minister, which advocated New Zealand signing up, acceding through legislation to three international conventions which would have protected our taxpayer when this accident occurred. Now, this accident was foreseeable, this accident was avoidable, and this accident could have been protected the taxpayers' money, greater, but because of decisions made by the Minister, Stephen Joyce, who's in the House, the taxpayers had to front up. We know from Minister Nick Smith the taxpayer has cost $130 million, the cost of the Rena oil spill to date. It wasn't only the shock that people in the Bay of Plenty and around the country saw, this had a huge fiscal impact on the taxpayer. What we know is that Stephen Joyce must be the most unpopular minister around the National Cabinet table. Well, that's what we hear from Whale Oil's blogs anyway. But it's a cunning case study of how a minister can leave a mess for other ministers. Because what we saw in 2008, Minister Joyce had on his table a briefing saying, you need to protect the taxpayer. The Labour government had done all the work. They'd even started drafting the thing. And Minister Joyce said, oh, no, don't worry, our future minister can deal with that. The taxpayer will pick up the tab. Just like in transport. The minister, the Colossus of Road, goes around the country announcing $14 billion of motorways. Then he leaves it up to the current minister, Jerry Brownlee, who has to face the music that there just isn't enough money in the kitty. We saw the biofuel strategy we saw this morning on the radio, where Stephen Joyce is now welcoming North Skog, moving to Tasmania and enlarging their plant. And all of a sudden, biofuels is on the government's agenda, despite in May the government scrapped all biofuel support. Curious, it's a case study in how a minister can leave a mess for other ministers. But the serious issue is that his very purposeful decisions has meant the taxpayers had to pick it up. But it's good we're seeing these international liabilities finally getting acceded to, after some of them were actually negotiated decades ago, and taxpayers picking up the tab. It's good to see, but I also want to point out that the government's missing a whole bunch of other steps. Now, it's good to see the government's finally listened to our oil spill protection plan, released in October last year, but unfortunately they missed out a couple of the other parts the Green Party is calling for, like an inquiry into the Rena. It's almost a whole year since we had the Rena. We've had a couple of government inquiries, but no broad-based inquiries looking at the role that these in many cases untrained foreign crews have on New Zealand waters. We have one of the least regulated shipping regimes in the world. What role did that play? We need an inquiry to look at why on earth didn't the government have oil spill equipment in the country? They were meant to be able to deal with an oil spill of 3,500 tonnes, but they struggled and needed 2 airplane loads full of equipment to cope with a spill of only a few hundred tonnes. We need to know why the government refused the advice of both corporates and unions for a rapid response multi-purpose oil response vessel. That's why we need an inquiry. It's high time the government got on and announced one. We need to ask the question why the government hasn't taken the advice from the Green Party again in our plan to adequately fund the Oil Pollution Fund. Now, this government raided it. It was $12 million to cope when accidents like these happen. They raided it and only left $3.4 million, but we know the cost is $130 million. We know the government raided Maritime New Zealand's transport pantry, leaving them without adequate funds, and they've ignored our advice, which actually recycle the funds from fuel excise levy paid on boaties, which currently gets spent on the roads. Why don't you use that to adequately fund Maritime New Zealand to protect the environment we love? And lastly, what about compulsory shipping lanes, bringing back a form of flagging of Kiwi vessels on our waters? So I won't go into detail on the 3 maritime conventions, but I've got to also add, while we're increasing the access to amounts that New Zealand government can access in case of an accident like this, when a ship spills and the bunker fuel goes out, there's no change to the Resource Management Act, which was also shown to be woefully inadequate. $130 million cost. Under the government's law, they could only claim $600,000. They saw the light on the EZ bill and actually increased it, but why aren't we amending the Resource Management Act to allow those penalties to be increased here? Why aren't we increasing the insurance amount required for oil drilling? We know the government wants to go on this risky, dangerous deep-sea oil drilling binge. We know in the Gulf of Mexico it cost the American government and oil companies $40 billion. Yet this government says, oh, it's all right, guys, just have $30 million in insurance and that's all you need. We also see the government failing to sign up to the Oil Pollution Compensation Fund's supplementary fund, which in the case of a tanker having a spill means the government's got access to more than $1.7 billion US. Again, a missing piece of the puzzle that we've been raising in Select Committee, hearing from the experts. We look forward to engaging constructively. We acknowledge this legislation is trying to improve the legislative regime for New Zealand, and as such we'll work constructively to try and improve it even further. Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.
Jamie Lee Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, it's a shame that such a significant event like the Rena